My porn stash.
He said as I hit record.
Click, got it.
All right, everybody. 1, 2, 3. Welcome to A Heathen Thing podcast. I am Mathias Nordvig.
I'm Lonnie Scott.
Awesome. Yes, and we are joined today by our crew, the crew behind the podcast. We have Dani Moore and Jameson Foster. And let's just start with Jameson. Jameson, what is your role on the podcast?
Hello, everyone. I am Jameson, and I am becoming Matthias's pocket sound guy, where I have been doing the sound for the Sacred Flame since the beginning. And now I'm also doing the sound for this podcast. And I also am responsible for the intro and the outro music, High Mountain Rag, under my musician moniker Scuzzlebutt. So really happy to be here. Fell in love with the first episode. So thank you guys for including me in this. It's a really, really cool project.
Thank you for
Awesome.
the backup, my friend, and being
You
part
got
of
it.
all of this. Also, we shouldn't fail to mention that you're also the person behind the Nordic Sound channel, where you interview musicians that, are, if nothing else, vaguely interesting to the people who would also be listening to this podcast.
Yeah. I've been doing the Nordic Sound channel. I'm going on year 3 of its current state. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Have interviews across genres. It's not just the quote unquote Viking music stuff. If you're interested in traditional Nordic music, just the various Nordic music traditions from all over the region across genres, come check me out over on the Nordic Sound channel. It's a lot of wisdom in Nordic music traditions, and that's sort of what I'm trying to explore over there. So thank you,
Cool.
Matthias.
Dani, what do you do for the Heathen Thing podcast?
Hi, my name is Dani, and I am the behind the scenes person. I run the Instagram page, and I also am a Discord mod for the A Heathen Thing podcast. Um, yeah, I like to be behind the scenes. Please don't ask me too many questions.
Well, thank you so much for your hard work. We appreciate
Yes.
all the work that you guys are doing for us.
Yes, thank you both very much.
Yeah, man, it's our pleasure. Love to be a part of this.
Awesome. Well, this time we are talking about heathen values and ethics. And this is, of course, going to be a much broader and bigger topic than what we could cram into this like 1 hour. But we'll make sure that we get around as much as possible. Right, Lonnie?
That's right. And, we thought it'd be good for episode 2 because talking about heathen ethics and values it's an easy subject, no problems, no pitfalls,
Totally
no
straightforward.
contentious issues, nowhere. Not to mention the history is just perfect and clean.
Right. It's so straightforward.
Yeah.
No, but on one hand, we both thought that it was, an important subject, of course, but also natural to follow up on that based on what we talked about last time with like, what is a heathen? After, like, starting out there. Well, we both got into like, yeah, there's got to be something about like, common ideas of moral codes or stuff, right? So yeah. Well, I mean, shall we just kick it off and say, Lonnie, what are heathen values to you?
Yes, absolutely. Heathen values for me are complicated on one hand because, just in general, looking at religion for your values seems troublesome to me in a lot of ways. Growing up in a widely Christian culture, that even they have their own denominations, their own prejudices, and their own values seem to clash amongst themselves. And in heathenry, we're such a minority of a minority wider umbrella of paganism that, we obviously have our bigger clashes. So for me, as a heathen, my own values and ethics, I think of them first. How do I live? Like how do I conduct myself even if no one's going to know? And secondly, how do I relate to my community around me and the world that I live in? Also, considering the ultimate level of even when no one will know, how do I behave and act then? Because at the core of all of this, at the core of most of these values, I think is it's our actions. What do we do? How do we actually live out what we are calling our ethics and values? And that's where I'm coming from.
Mm. So is it for you, is it attached to in any kind of way like the gods themselves? Like do you like feel responsible to the gods like for acting in a certain way? Like just like you find it, for instance, in Christian belief system?
No, not
No.
really. No,
I
I
knew
don't.
the answer on that
Yeah,
one.
and say I don't think anything that we do or say or anything are necessarily going to offend gods and goddesses. Assuming that they're real with their own individual consciousness and abilities and powers and influence thereof. What am I in my microscopic life going to possibly do to upset Odin or Frigg or Freya or Thor or anyone? Um, and people can get in all the arguments they want about that. That's just where I am. No, I think one of the coolest things about heathenry and my interpretation of it is that that could be the least important thing. The most important thing is how you live in this world now.
Mm,
That's what matters. Um, how do my children think of me?
mhm.
How does my community, my friends, how do they think of me?
Right.
That reputation is far more important to me than anything that a divine being could say or do.
Okay. I mean, I know that you said that you don't really care what people actually have to say about that, but I do want to ask you one question about that.
Yeah.
And that is okay, so I think a lot of people would say, well, if there's not like a divine being holding you accountable,
Hmm.
then like what's the point in like believing in or having rituals to these gods and all that kind of stuff? Like, sorry
Hmm.
to put you on the spot with this one, but what would you
Mm.
say to that?
No, that's perfect, and that's fine. I don't think those things are tied together.
Hmm.
Ritual and devotional work or honoring, making offering or something to allies of the spirit world, whether gods, goddesses, land spirits, elves, whatever you're into. And I'm into all of it, by the way. Uh, is about building a relationship with those beings and having that back and forth, that being connected to whatever it is that they are. Um, when it comes to morals and ethics of my behavior, my actions, my character, that is uh, that's important to me in the connection and relationship to everyone around me and the world around me, as far as my impact on their lives and their impact on me. I think that's where we delve into concepts like weird and other things like that are tied to heathenry, because that influence is it's give and take. It's a cycle that we can't even explain sometimes. And you are a conscious being, right? All three of you here on my screen, you're all conscious beings. You're
Well,
imbued with some
so.
sort of right. You're imbued with some sort of consciousness, and so is my dog, and so are the crows outside, and on and on and on. And at the core of that, I've got to do something to respect that. Um, the most heathen value I have in my brain comes nowhere from heathenry, but I think it fits, and it's Bill and Ted when they say be excellent to each other,
I'd say that's a very heathen value.
Great. Yeah, have them all too.
Yeah.
Odin's next adventure.
In a phone booth.
Right. But
No,
I mean,
I
does that help clear up your question?
absolutely no. I
Yeah.
that's very relatable. I think in many ways along the same lines. Personally, There's also there might be some bigger things that's what you like were hinting at when you were talking about weird, right? Like that is like an interconnectedness with the entire world, our entire cosmos, right? So I think there's a lot we can dive into with that one that I probably will have a bunch of comments on. But before that, I think we should hear from Jameson as well, because he graciously volunteered to also chip in with his thoughts on all of this. So
yes, he did.
Since you're here, JMO.
Yeah, so there was something Lonnie said in the last episode that resonated with me so much that I actually went and listened back to what he said a few times to really sort of like get the gravity of what he was saying. And that was sort of when you guys also got to the same sort of conversation last time about what are the gods to heathens, right? And now I don't know if this was the same for you guys, but like back in the day, like 10 years ago, the gods were everything to anyone who wanted to get into paganism, and it had its own sort of dogma associated with it. And Mathias might fall asleep because I've told him this story before, and that's okay. Now's your time, Mathias. That back in the day, for so many of us growing up without many people to talk to about this, where do we go? We go to internet forums, Discord servers, Dani. But not 10 years ago. But right, you end up at places, public forums of other people who label themselves as pagans, heathens, what have you. And I remember that even from the beginning, I was really sort of struggling with this idea of gods, right? Of believing in these anthropomorphic higher powers, right, as literal beings. And I remember I brought this up on the r/Norse subreddit, God Save My Soul. I used to frequent this space, and I made this comment there, like, does anyone else like not view the gods as literal beings, but as something else? And everyone said, dude, you're an atheist. What are you doing here? You don't believe in gods? Then you're an atheist. And even though at that time I was 18, whatever, I know myself well enough to know I'm not an atheist, right? And so for only 10 years ago, for that to be like the overwhelmingly majority answer, like, oh, if you don't believe in the gods literally, then you're an atheist. To hear now, you guys talking so openly about how it's not really that much of it, right? It can absolutely be. If the gods as anthropomorphic higher beings are important to you and that gives you meaning, then please, more power to you. But I've always taken the Neil Gaiman American Gods approach to gods, and that is that they're metaphors largely. We sort of put ideas into them and we maybe anthropomorphize them because it's easier to relate to that way. But I think the example one of you brought up last time was that Thor is not some bearded dude in the sky, but he is the storms. Like he is the storms. There's no medium between it, right? And so for me, it was like 10 years later getting what's the word? Vindication for I knew I was not an atheist, right? And I knew that these things I was very interested in. But I also think it's an important conversation to have, because you will never find me at somewhere like Midgard's Blow being the dude yelling Hail Odin. Like never. That's just not my speed. But I used to be told if that's not your speed, then you're not really pagan. You're not really heathen, right? And so that's why I really wanted to participate in this conversation of values. Yeah.
It sounds to me like you might have run into the Ausa bro crowd right there.
Which I'm learning that's what r/Norse was.
Yeah.
Essentially. I only know that looking back, but you learn as you grow.
Yeah, pretty much any internet forum with way too many people talking over each other. That's what it's going to turn into. I think there's something important to note about all of this, and that is this idea that if you don't believe, then you're not, right? That is at its foundation, in its core, in its entire structure, a Christian way of thinking about religion. This is inherent to the Christian term credo, right? Like the creed, right? If you don't believe, then you're not Christian, right? So if anybody shows up and says, if you don't believe, then you're not heathen, then they sound like Christians and probably are more in line with Christians on that whole idea, right? No, I this is also why we were, sort of like, I wouldn't say struggling, but hesitant last time when we were like defining what is a heathen, right?
Mhm.
Because I didn't want to come out and just say, well, you have to believe in the gods. No, you don't. You don't have
You
to
don't know.
believe. You can have a relationship to the gods, and you don't have to have a relationship to the gods in terms of like anthropomorphic beings. You can have a relationship to the gods as like, these figures in stories, right? And or something else, right? So it's much more expensive, right? And this is also what I personally always highlighted about well, heathen religion. And I'm talking broadly, not just like in a particular Nordic context, but broadly what from the monotheistic perspective would be considered heathen religions, right? So any, for instance, indigenous tradition, like all of these traditions have come out of people basically communicating with their world, right? Ritual is communication with the world, right? Coming up with stories about your world that like include all these what we would call supernatural beings or something like that. That is exactly that communication, right? So that's to me what's inherent in being heathen, and also what informs that broader discussion I hinted at before, right? Because if you are a person who walks around out there in the world and you realize you're connected to your world, then you also realize that you are morally and ethically bound to everything around you in some capacity, right? It means that you have to realize that you can affect what you encounter, whether it's that rock right out there outside my window, or it's a tree, or it's a mountain, or it's a river, or it's a human being, or it's a deer or a hippo. I don't care. You will always have a relationship to it, right? If nothing else, if you encounter a hippo somewhere along an African river, your relationship might be to die, if nothing else, right? Because they're highly aggressive.
Yeah,
Um,
and Matthias, that is that sort of is the crux of that book I lent you that's somewhere on the shelf behind you, Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, where
yes.
we're taking that very not religious, whatever you want to call it, this mythological metaphysical look at it. But the whole crux of Vibrant Matter is like another word for it is like mundane animism, where
Hmm.
like forming relationships with the things that we've previously deemed as inert or meaningless is the first step to rehabilitating a relationship with it. So when you look to things like a landfill, even basically is one of her examples, and you realize that you actually have a relationship to that landfill in several ways. You contribute to it, and the toxic runoff from it is going into the water you drink. Suddenly you're part of a whole network of things, and you need to sort of acknowledge that relationship you have to your surroundings, not just in the living things, but what we also call the non-living things. That's sort of like the first step to relation building, is that acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I'd say that, to me, that's a core value of what it means to be heathen. Like, thinking like that, living in accordance with that as best as I can, because also keep in mind, it's not easy when you're locked into like these exploitative networks that create the landfills, right? Like,
Exactly.
so, but that to me, that is a very important heathen value, right? That recognition that we are connected to everything that exists around us, and also every other human, and that then means that we have to, if nothing else, make a decision about it, right? Like as an individual, I have to come to some kind of conclusion, and I mean that conclusion could be to just run around and act like an ass. But this is where we get into something else, right? And that is the
That's called
reciprocal
nihilism.
aspect. That is nihilism or cynicism, right? Um, but but that's where we get into the reciprocal aspects, right? That are highlighted throughout northern heathen culture, right? In all the old reading material that we get from our ancestors, right? They highlight this aspect of reciprocity, right? What comes around goes around. This is something that we modern humans also perfectly understand, and captured in what comes around goes around, right?
And before the topic gets away, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
that I do give credit where credit is due. It would not be without like Runa's Nordic animism thing that didn't sort of like rewire or help rewire my brain into looking at heathenism that way, right? Is, you know, Matthias, I still remember when I was sitting on Zoom because it was still pandemic, and you were like, "You're familiar with Nordic animism, right?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And that was my first time. Like, I Googled it and I was like, this was the missing piece, right? It's not this
Mhm.
side of it that's, you know, all about yelling Hail Thor around a bonfire. It's that interconnectivity that he's really highlighting with that project too. That was really formative to me, and realizing that there were many different kinds of heathenism or being heathen.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you can say something, Lonnie.
No, I'm
You
just
took the
agreeing with him.
mic.
I thought that was an excellent way to say that, because I can be that heathen around the fire and happily be that heathen yelling Hail Odin and
And there ain't
screaming
nothing wrong with it.
at the
Ain't
No,
top
it's
of
nothing
my
wrong
kind
with
of
it.
fun,
lungs.
you know.
Yeah, and I really like it. But I'm also a very contemplative person too. Like, I would say, even, you know, like my relationship to that concept, like Odin, for example, would be more along the lines of, I'm more inspired to live a life that seeks wisdom and faces hardships, even though I know they're going to be hard, and enjoy cemeteries and try to talk to the dead. And and all of that, some in many regards, is inspired by Odin. But those are my values, I guess.
And anyone who grew up in New England is going to hear you talk about walking through cemeteries and be like, that's just where we go walking. All of our parks are cemeteries. You want to go walk through the park, you're walking through 17th century graves.
Yeah, but I do it at night when you're not
Yeah.
supposed to, and yell at some poor grave and be like, "Tell me your secrets."
Yeah, and Lonnie, thank you so much. I do want to clarify that like there is literally nothing wrong with being the Hail Odin guy. It's about having like a more diverse network of approaches, right? Is because
Yes.
when you go into it being like, are we all supposed to be doing that? Because I don't really feel like doing that, right? Like that's more of the, and you know, everyone over here is like, do it or you're fired, right? And I'm like, okay, ugh, all right.
And
We
a
all
lot
need
of this,
we need all types.
right? And a lot of this gets back to the heart of what it means to be inclusive too, right? In that we're including ourselves in the wider world through our relationship to it. And if you were to section yourself off from it, and by these weird ways that other factions of heathenry might do, you reduce your exposure to possible wisdom, knowledge, access to gifts and reciprocity, and a richer, fuller, more colorful life. And yeah, that's kind of the point I wanted to make, I guess.
No, I think that's
Yeah.
a really important point, because you know, somebody who's cynical about all this could then be like, okay, cool. So you got a little more flavor to your life, Lonnie. So what, right? I'm I don't need that. I can live in a hole in the ground instead, or something like that, right?
Oh, not
But
if you've had Mexican food, you can never live in a hole in the ground after that.
So my devil's advocate approach right now is to get to another point, and that is that you know, you said it when you said like these networks are expansive, right? And actually without articulating it, you pointed towards another thing, and that is when you have a large, strong network, then you also have increased survivability, right?
Yes.
As
Yes.
a human being, that is a lesson everybody's ancestors have learned at some point. Then we, you know, started making coal factories and forgot all about it afterwards, except for, you know, those workers working in the coal factories that were like, well, we want to get paid, right? So they started creating networks, and then we had something else, right? That became, you know, its own little thing. But
Thanks, Matthias. Now I have to go listen to Panopticon's Kentucky again.
Yeah. This has been a special break from the Sacred Flame podcast.
The point is, though, right?
Surprise.
Oh yeah, this is just like me hiding the sacred flame inside another podcast.
Russian nesting doll of podcasts.
Yes.
Where's Dan? Is Dan in here somewhere?
I've already brought up ghosts and cemeteries. We're covered, man.
Yeah,
We got
that's
our
right. Yeah, pitching the web as well, right? No, so my point was simply that, like, when we realize that, networks create survivability, then we also understand, right, that what is really at the center of all of this is veneration of life, right? Like, as soon as you are creating such networks, right, that enhance your ability to survive in any kind of setting, right? If, for instance, you are an agreeable heathen who has been out there in the world and established contact with other agreeable heathens, right, then you might find yourself being able to sleep on somebody's couch or their guest bed or something like that in, pretty much any country in the Northern Hemisphere, right, as a possibility, right?
That's
That's
a book that needs to be written, by the way. The
The
Agreeable Heathen.
I was about to
Heathen.
say,
Actually, I like that.
Somebody write that book.
Mathias, it's your next AI trade book. I'm never allowed back on this podcast.
No, you're not. No, so my point is then that at the center of heathen ethics, if you ask me, right, if we draw the conclusion from this, is also to uphold life, right? That is a core value of heathenry as well. You must uphold and support life, right? And I would say that if we look at historical heathenry, at least to the extent that it has been expressed in literature, right, medieval literature, what we're seeing there is rituals, rituals centered around the idea of creating life, right? That is what is encapsulated in the Old Norse phrase, the Arsok Fridar, right? For good harvest and peace, which you find in all that literature out there from Iceland from 1200 and something, right? So we see that idea present with the historical material, right? Also with some archaeological artifacts here and there that mention this a bountiful harvest or something like that. That's what they made rituals for. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well, that there's some consistency if we think about it in those terms.
I agree.
I know we're the guests here, but can I ask a question?
Of course.
What do you guys think is a heathen relationship to tradition? Like, what do the two have in common, if anything? Because if we're talking about ethics and values, traditionalism is not heathenism, is not paganism, but very often we find that they sort of flirt with each other every now and again, right? Especially, like, I would say that tradition is a huge part of it, but I don't know if we ever talk about it in that way. I know Mathias brings up tradition as a concept, right? But what traditions, whose traditions? Because it's clearly like inspired by traditionalism movements, right? And over on when I'm doing my folk music work, I'm always advocating for just how heathen folk music is, right? But it's sort of like hidden deep down, and that's like one example of when they rub shoulders, right? Like modern heathenism with traditions, regardless of how old they are. And I just wonder if tradition is a part of the conversation of heathen values. Like, what relationship, if any, do we have with tradition?
When you're talking about tradition and you just like reference music, is that what you mean? Just like different aspects of culture, traditional aspects, or do you just mean
any aspects of culture and any tradition, right?
Okay.
Like, as we said, we're inclusive. We're not dogmatic about it has to be a Norwegian tradition, right?
Right. I guess the way I look at it, to some degree, yeah, we are delving into something of tradition in a way because we're inspired by what we call Nordic mythology and Nordic story world, or Nordic Germanic art, or something to that effect, right? There's something from these cultures that existed before that are now gone, elements of that have survived, And the best things about that have been very inspiring to those of us who have reimagined and recreated heathenry. But at the same time, I think we're just as and maybe not even if not more so sometimes, at least for me, inspired by the world we're actually living in than, some ancient tradition, because there's a lot about whatever world these stories came from originally. I sure as fuck wouldn't want to live in.
Well, you don't
It
want
was,
you don't want cholera? What's wrong with
yeah,
cholera?
it was
Or
kind
the
of stabby,
plague.
stabby too. A lot of stabby, stabby.
What, you don't want your neighboring village to all of a sudden band together and invade you to steal your women?
No, I
No,
Or
mean,
worse, your cows. We
yeah.
got some pretty good looking cows over in the foster farm.
Yeah, I've got 3 daughters. I don't like that world. That's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. But I like there's enough of it that's cool that we are inspired by and bring forward. So I guess as I'm understanding your question, yeah, I think to a degree we're touching on some tradition, because these things came from a culture, that's lost to time in many ways, and we're taking out surviving elements of that to build something new. So it's in the bedrock of what we're doing. Even the most creative, free thinking of us are still touching that story world somehow and creating something new out of it. So yeah, I think to that degree we're tied in to something that somebody might call tradition. But beyond that, I'm trying to be as anti-dogmatic as a human possibly can be within the framework of trying to build something as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to consider that question that you raised there, Jameson, and also in regards to that, then also consider, well, what does it mean to say tradition, right? Because we see different things happening in heathen communities. First and foremost, we typically see somebody try to turn something that is a very recent phenomenon into an ancient phenomenon, and claim that that is tradition. Then we have we have all of these, and this isn't just a heathen phenomenon. That's very much also extremely a Christian phenomenon, right? To talk about traditional values, and those traditional values are like something that was invented in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Don't really go that far back when it comes down to it, but it fits into their paradigm today. That kind of stuff. You see that in heathenry too, right? I mean, just think of the nuclear family. Like that's like an example of traditional values. Like that shit was invented in the, like the early 20th century, really. Like that's when the nuclear family really becomes a thing, right? You have a lot of other types of family structures before that, and then you have the marketization of the nuclear family in the 1940s and 50s, right? Because it fits into the way that especially the US is organizing its economy at the time, but also the rest of the Western world, and spreads as a phenomenon and an ideal, right? So that's not how family was organized in the Viking Age, my friends.
So if we say that traditional knowledge like is at the bedrock of heathenism, right? I wonder then if we're in the context of talking about values and ethics, right? Do heathens have any responsibility to tradition, or to any particular tradition that inspires a current heathen practice or anything? So I think about that a lot. I think about like because Lonnie brings up a good point, right? It's sort of like there is always that tension between tradition and progression, right? And in a lot of ways, they need each other. Or at least I think so. That would be a whole other conversation. But I always wonder, like, to what degree are heathens responsible to that tradition that others have for us to use today over centuries?
Well, I actually see the tradition is split. I see two types of tradition when it comes to heathenry, right? And we have responsibility to both of them. We have a responsibility to that tradition that is not actually tradition, but it's called tradition. Those are the constructions based off of power structures that especially emerge in the 19th century and materialize as political projects in the 20th century, right? And the most well-known and like worst example is what happens with the Völkisch movement and turns into the Nazi movement, right? That's one example. But there are others out there. Like you could also look at, for instance, the constructions of nationalisms in various countries, primarily the Scandinavian countries and Iceland, right? But also other countries that tie into these ideas of tradition, a sort of like a Viking tradition or something like that. And that's the kind of shit that you see in popular culture circulating widely today. Like most movies or TV shows or comic books or whatever they are really Amon Amarth is a great example, actually, like music, since it's your specialty, my friend.
Man, I reach for that NyQuil bottle every time I see someone share a Danheim track and call it traditional Nordic folk
Right.
music. So you're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, no, so like what we get there, right, is like repackaging of most of that stuff that was invented in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? Then on the other hand, then we have an actual tradition, right? And that is a much more ephemeral kind of like concept to most people because it comes from so far back in time, right? And it's very difficult to get a good sort of like broad overview of like what is it actually, right? A lot of people will be familiar with like the Poetic Edda, right? And then assume that is the tradition, right? Or Snorri Sturluson's Edda, commonly known as the Eddas, right? And then sometimes they will, not really understand what the Eddas are, and then assume that other literature is also part of that or not, or something like that. So there's a lot of confusion around that as well. But personally, I refer to it as the story world, the Nordic story world, which is an inclusive concept, right? And it's not just limited to like the Viking Age or the period just after the Viking Age, even though most of the material comes from that period. It goes farther back, and it also goes farther into the future, from like the point of the Viking Age. And it's not just literature; it's also rock carvings and archaeology and a lot of other things, right? And anybody who's interested can always listen to the Sacred Flame podcast. um, so it's like this is where it gets more iffy, right? Because that is a tradition. That is a tradition that was alive once, and has been alive up until this point, and still alive, I would say, in different ways, primarily with scholars, unfortunately. And that's yeah, because the scholars are the ones who know about all of this material. Some people who are not scholars will be well read in the material and know a lot of it, which is good. But there's of course the unfortunate component to a lot of that is that being familiar with and aware of that tradition quite often leads people to then like interpret it in context of that popular tradition that was invented in the 19th and 20th century, right? Or simply just align it with what they're familiar with from popular culture now, right? You often see Viking bros sort of like in the meme with the lady with all the math and geometry going around her head, right? Trying to align their knowledge of, like, I don't know, God of War with like the source material that we have, mm-hmm. Right? Those kinds of things happen all the time, right? And this brings me to another thing I would say that is a core heathen value. If you are a person who has broad, widespread knowledge of this historical tradition, then I would also say that it is on you to then make that as available as possible in a sound, presentation, so to speak, to people, right? Like simply having, if you have the knowledge, then you should also, to some degree, in at least in your personal heathen community, um, make that knowledge available and make your knowledge about this stuff available to your fellow heathens, right? Because this is the problem that any culture that has been has suffered a concerted effort to get killed, essentially, right? That we have lost our elders, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've lost people who were capable of and trained in the tradition, right? And that actual tradition, and not just a fake memory of the tradition or somebody's fictional representation of the tradition. And so we do have a responsibility to then try to actually bring that tradition back the best as we can, right? And this is not, me advocating for gurus out there, because there are plenty of those, and they do not do a good job at that stuff. I see your websites, I see your Discord servers, and that's a lot of bullshit, guys.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you for the vindication, Mathias, direct or otherwise, because that's the whole reason I started doing the Nordic Sound channel, was to like use like actual knowledge of what Nordic music is to try and teach people who want to know. Because I am very serious. Like, that grifter Peyton Parrish has convinced an entire generation of people that like Viking music was Disney music. And that's a problem, right? And so instead of trying to like educate those who want to learn, from, you've heard me talk about this, Mathias, is just like folk, like the folk musicians are in a lot of ways tradition bearers by virtue of being folk musicians. And that's why I advocate for them in particular, because that music is one of the most tangible connections we have to that time. And it is also resonates with people on a personal, a collective, and a cosmic level. And yeah, that is why I personally put a lot of focus on folk music in trying to like get more heathens into it, because folk music wasn't Peyton Parrish or Danheim or something. It's something that connects us farther back. And it's a world that's worth understanding as it is, rather than like, as much as we're allowed to have fantasies of it in our current time, I think it's far more pressing to have a more coherent or cohesive knowledge of how it was before we start to make fantasies on what we want it to be. And that's just part of transmitting that knowledge.
Yeah.
Ooh, I
That's
agree.
fair. I get all of that, what you guys are saying. And I agree, we do want as much real knowledge, of what really existed before that we can, be inspired by. But I think it's easy to forget. I mean, how many decades now consecutively have people been practicing some kind of thing that they're going to call heathen or Asatru? I mean, we've got several decades of it, right? And some things have kind of coalesced into that's how heathens do ritual. There is a common format that is sort of shaped up to become what we all call bloats now. There is a common format for what we have all called symbols now. These are just a couple examples, right? And I also think in this modern era that we're in, we kind of are in a similar period. I think that early Christians might have been with various cults, maybe in the Roman period, that we have such wider access now to reach people and platforms by which we can be heard. That I think
what you're saying is that we should sit down and start writing crank letters to
yeah,
out there, like
we
like
need
Paul
an
did.
emperor to see a vision of Mjolnir in the sky. No, no. What I'm saying is, we have all these different various factions and ways of being heathen now that do have a lot of similarities, regardless of the differences. I think we're in a period where we're going to see the final formations of what we are going to call traditions, I guess, that will be what future generations practice for some time to come. And that is also why I think it's important that we know more about what really came before, so it can be better informed, it can be better inspired. but I in no way, shape, or form want to bring back anything more accurate into my practice than, yeah, I also give offerings to the local rivers and the land spirits and the trees. Like I don't want some of the awful shit that we know they did, to come
Well,
back and be part of this.
so I think it's important to clarify that what James and I are talking about is not like some kind of like corrective approach, right? Where you're like, what you're doing here doesn't accord with what this saga says or something like that, right? No, it's a responsibility to actually know what is described in that historical tradition. And this is the
And
important thing. Yes, and also know what that literary tradition looked like. Like for instance, let's take the Blot, right? Um,
Mhm.
we can find descriptions of Blot in the sagas from medieval Iceland. And then we can say, okay, so what you're doing here does not line up with what is described over here. Where's all the horse sacrifices and stuff like that, right? And yeah, cool, fine. So you reach that point that you can like compare what somebody's doing out here in contemporary meat space with what somebody wrote about
I
the
should have
past
trademarked that.
space. But what is also part of that responsibility is to know that this stories that we do have that describe these like blood sacrifices in the sagas are most likely constructions based off of a medieval author's cursory knowledge of what Jews were doing in certain rituals, right? Like so that's something to keep in mind too, that the critical perspective on that literature needs to be present as well, right?
Mhm.
Um, and beyond that, it's much more important to just know the stories, to have the stories as a general reference point, right? So that I can say to you in an offhand remark, just like that time when Scott Gimson had to haul ass out of the Disa thing because otherwise he was going to get killed by the Norwegian king. And you would know exactly what I'm talking about, right? That's what we need. Rather than, somebody being like, oh, what you doing over there doesn't really look like what I read about something over here, right? That's
Yeah.
just uninteresting, right?
Or about the time he wrote the hate poetry to Odin.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to have those reference points instead, right? Because that means then that we can take that modern ritual that arguably has become a living tradition now, right? Of Blot, and then we can furnish it with a bunch of mutually agreed upon stories, right? And
Mm.
make it more interesting, right?
And things like that have become more interesting anyway over time. I mean, they started off very, very Wiccan inspired and ceremonial magic looking, and have moved further into, like making offering to land spirits and calling on, allies and powers thereof, and something that feels a little more animistic in practice than something that you might do in your basement with chalk outlines on the floor, you know. And if that's your thing, hey, do you, boo? I want to talk to the trees.
Right. Okay. A couple of
No,
things.
I say we throw Dani into the fire here. What
Dani
is
has sat
Dani?
here peacefully all along.
What does Dani have to say? She's gotten off easy.
I know. I mean, it's a little off topic, but I mean, kind of going back to like what our main values are. I think for me, like learning in like sort of this new space of kind of like animism and like heathenism. I'm a little bit new, like still learning a lot of stuff, but I feel like a large part of it is I feel like a large part of it is healing. Like whether it's healing yourself or you're healing the land around you, like because we are so interconnected, like healing is such a major part of like building those connections and like maintaining those connections. And that was just something I thought of as you guys were talking is, like as things are like kind of coming up in my mind and like, oh, what are my values? And like, what are my ethics? That's the one that really stood out to me personally.
So how do you
I
go
like
about
that.
healing?
Told you not to ask me questions, but okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's not our fault.
That's
You've
why
been
I haven't
quiet.
thrown you a ball.
She's like, I just wanted to sit and listen.
And then Jameson said no.
No.
Sucker punch at the last minute.
What is healing? It could take so many different forms. Like, there's like healing yourself where it's like, like learning self-love or like self-confidence. And like that's something that I'm really working on if it wasn't obvious. Um, but also like taking care of like the land around you. Like, um, maybe it's something as simple as like picking up trash that you see on the ground, or just being mindful of like how, like when you're camping, like when you're leaving it better than how you found it. There's like little things that you can do that like to me, I feel like can make a big difference in the long run.
I love that.
Mhm.
It is the little things that add up to all this other stuff. If you're only just waiting for that next ritual or that next holiday or something, like that's you and your practice, but it's the little things you do all along the way between those that have the biggest impact on you, your well-being, and your community and everything around you. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I think you also mentioned it where it's like it's about how you act when no one else is watching. Like that's kind of a lot of what it boils down to.
Yeah, that's what it is for me. When people call it, generically or metaphorically or whatever, your North Star, right? That's how people kind of, at least around here, that's how people refer to their own ethics and values. They say, "Oh, that's my North Star, or that's my moral compass." Just
Nice.
to
I like
generally
that.
state that kind of thing. But for me, all of that's great while you're living your life and with other people, and you're being seen, I guess. But ultimately, your personal set of ethics and values don't don't get really tested until it's when nobody really is going to pat you on the back or something. Like it's only you that will know. Those situations is where you're really going to be tested.
If you're just doing it for the gram, it doesn't count. Like
Yeah.
Danny, I was just about to bring up like how important that conversation is in a time when like everything is so performative, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
so we even before Instagram, fishermen had a saying, did you really catch that fish if you didn't take a picture, right? And a lot of times now Instagram has made your whole life like that, right? Did you really pick up that trash if you didn't post a selfie with the Pepsi can, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
so important to like know that like to catch yourself doing that because we're kind of trained to do that, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, I just think
No,
that's a very important thing to bring up.
I agree. Get offline, go outside. Like just
No, I live here.
stop living in that square. And no, a great
It's safe
example of
here.
this. I mean, three of the four of us have were just at a festival together. We were at Cascadian Midsummer, Jameson and Danny. I hope you remember that. Um,
Think Danny
Lo-
remembers it.
yeah.
I wasn't there.
Lonnie unfortunately wasn't there, but you'll have to join us. And I don't have a single picture from that festival. Like not a single one. I didn't take a picture of anybody or myself or a tree or anything, because of living in the moment and with the community, right? Because it was a community instead of, what is taking pictures and putting them up online really about? Well, it's about your own loneliness, my friend.
It's also about the funny captions, like the
And
like the
And
view.
sometimes they're
Yeah,
good.
the
I
the
yeah.
funny
mean,
captions, right? They
Matthias and
also
I were
feed into
recently in Huntsville, Alabama, and I took video. I didn't take a lot of pictures, but I took video of the dancing thing because
Mhm.
Jacob from Highlung kept going, now forward, and backward, and forward, and backward. And everyone's trying to keep up with this dance, and it was funny. And yeah, I had to share that because it was funny.
And I want to use that as a real quick example, is that Jacob doing that dance is an immediate example of modern heathen communities using traditional knowledge. Because not a lot of people know this. You would know this if you watch the Nordic Sound channel. I did interview Jacob, and we talked about this quite a bit. A lot of people don't know that Jacob is primarily a folk musician. He stumbled into Heilung because it was fun, and he's good at it, right? But he also has so many of these other folk music projects, and so many of them do. You know, the core members of Heilung have Gottfolk, which is a more traditional, not exactly traditional, but yeah, like Jacob teaching everyone that is passing on traditional knowledge, and that ring dance not only encourages cooperation, coordination, but dancing together, making music together is also a very direct way to like really practice that connection to each other that we're all talking about.
Absolutely. No,
and it adds joy to the world, right?
Yes,
joy.
It does.
Joy is a very good heathen value, friends.
And I mean, yeah, for real, like he's also in the band Via Live, which has been sort of like the soundtrack of my heathenry for like the last nearly 30 years at this point, right? Like, I mean, that's a local Danish medieval band that has it's just like everywhere in like these like Viking markets and medieval markets in Denmark. So it's like to me, a lot of that is just straight up tradition, right? Because I have been listening to it forever. I wanted, before we wrap up, because we're coming up on an hour soon, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about like heathen values. And one of them I wanted to ask all of you is it a heathen value that you have to carry a weapon?
No.
If you follow Havamal rules.
That's why I'm asking it, right? Because it says so in Havamal, like, don't stray too far off from your weapon on the road, blah blah blah, right? And a lot of House of Bros out there definitely pick up on that one. And it's like, yeah, I should carry a gun, right?
It is funny that some of them get so much more airtime. Yeah.
I mean, does all the years of jujitsu and Kali and Kempo and martial arts I've trained count? I clearly don't do cardio anymore, but
I mean, that's really up to you, I guess. Like I'm not going to be this.
So I have the weapon.
you got the weapons already.
I am the weapon.
Yeah.
But I get tired fast.
So Lonnie says no. Jamo says no. Dani?
Hey, I said if you follow Havamal rules. I said it's a maybe.
Okay, it's a maybe.
Sorry, Dani. Needed to clarify.
It doesn't have to be. I mean, like your fists could be weapons, I feel like. Some sort of self-defense.
What about your charm?
Charm?
Can charm be a weapon?
I think it could be.
Oh yeah.
Havamal talks a lot about how dangerous charms are.
Yeah, that's true.
And look at what Colts do,
Yeah. Can a fish be a weapon?
I mean, it's big enough.
Yeah.
If you turn it into lutefisk.
Yeah, that's another way to turn it into a
I've
weapon.
never been slapped with a fish, but I feel like
I'm like, you know what? Okay, so what about like self-reliance? Is that a core heathen value? Because you hear that a lot too, right?
No, how can you be? Well, I mean, yeah, you can be reliant on yourself in certain situations or whatnot, but are you ever really reliant on yourself? Somebody had to clean the water you drink. Somebody had to pave the roads that you drive on. Somebody had to build the building that you live in. Someone got all the food that ended up in your supply chain. On and on and on and on. I mean, you can't ever really truly be self-reliant in a community.
No.
As the resident transcendentalist who's done his fair share reading of worshiping of Thoreau.
And by the way, it looks like somebody who scavenges roadkill. Go on.
And that's up for debate. What I will say is I do agree with what Lonnie said, But I also think I would consider if you were to put this into airplane terms, secure your own air mask before you help others. I think there's a level of self-reliance that where you can't help others unless you can rely on yourself. But it's in this very symbiotic relationship, not in a hyper individualism. I only matter,
Isn't
and
that
those
just
who I.
simply
Right.
a competent member of the community?
But wouldn't that also be self-reliance?
Certainly to an extent,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
and you can be
I
in that regard, sure,
Mhm.
but I don't think that's what people mean when they say
No,
self-reliance. I
that's
think
not
they're
what they
meaning
mean.
see. This
puff
is
out
why
the chest
Yeah.
and
I'm thinking of
you
it
Puff
know?
up
in. I'm
chest
thinking of it.
and like drive a F-150, you know.
That's why it gets cloudy because I'm thinking of it in that Thoreau sense, right? Of
Yeah.
like right, but it doesn't mean that anymore because it's not 1860. So
No. I
I'm
mean,
the one thinking you're
I'm
wrong.
I'm more along the lines of what you're thinking as well, with that, I think. Danny?
Yeah.
Uh, I don't think so. I mean, I really agree with what Jameson said, but if that's not self-reliance, then I guess not. Because I mean,
I mean,
like, because yeah, you have to. I mean, taking care of yourself helps take care of other people in the long run
mhm.
to an extent. So, but I don't think being exclusively reliant on yourself is really realistic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I
I think
agree
it's
with
I guess
that.
important to
it's I was just saying it's guess it's how much you zoom in, zoom out, right?
Mhm.
And how you're looking at this as a topic, because it is kind of a tricky one. But
Mhm.
you got the old American pull yourself up by the bootstraps idea of self-reliance and get
Mhm.
her done and all of that stuff. But I still maintain at a wider angle, someone had to pave the road, someone got the food, someone cleaned the water, someone, like all
Mhm.
of those things matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's intent, right? Are you being self-reliant because screw everyone else, or are you trying to be self-reliant because you want to be a better member of your community?
Hmm.
Yeah. And not to be a burden on others as well, like, just to work on not taxing people too much. That's also being part of a community, right?
I like that. Like looking at it from the opposite side. Like if because the opposite of being self-reliant is being over-reliant. Do you want to be that, right? So
Mm.
if we have to pick one direction, do I want to be the one that's very needy and can't help himself, or do I want to be the one that
Right.
can help
Do
himself
I
and
want to be
therefore
the
not
one
be a burden?
also, right?
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
want to be a burden. Like, no, I don't.
Well, right.
Do
Well, there
I
is
want
the
to be the guy who
concept.
always needs to hang out on somebody's
Yeah.
couch? Like,
Yeah.
Well, there is that concept of what is the golden mean or something like that.
Mhm.
You always want to kind of strike that middle balance with a lot of these things. You wouldn't want to be on the extreme
Oh,
end of either one of them. And
we're
that's
getting
digging
into
into different.
Odinic moderation here, right?
Yeah. Oh,
That's
have
yeah, that's
we?
what well, that's what Odin constantly talks about in Havamal. Like
Yeah.
moderation, moderation. Be chill,
Yeah.
be cool.
I'm
Don't be a
down with that.
jackass. Yeah,
I can totally dig that. I try.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Are there other ones, other like core examples, like something we hear out there in heathen space, whether it's in real life or in cyberspace, like other things that we should address, like with
Yes.
values. Yeah.
One that I think comes up everywhere, online spaces, events, public rituals. I've heard it, is frith.
Aha.
Yeah, the concept of frith is
Hmm.
definitely become a thing that isn't going away as a concept,
Good
and it's
example of something people pick up from the medieval literature.
mhm. And as it seems to be applied, it's just the higher level or higher thinking concept of there will be peace here.
Hmm.
You are not, there will be not, the conflict will not be tolerated within
Hmm.
wherever Frith has been declared. You will respect one another to the degree that it doesn't turn into something ugly.
Hmm.
But I hear that evoke like everywhere,
Hmm.
events, online spaces, everywhere. It's a thing.
Yeah. And is that a core heathen value? I mean,
I
it
think it
sounds
has
like it,
become now. It
right,
is
based on
now.
sheer
In
numbers.
Yeah.
transit.
Yeah. Yeah. It is now. I don't know how well understood it is all the time. I think it's one of those general feelings people get when they hear the word,
Mhm.
but they know, okay, I can't punch anybody in the face now or something.
It's funny that people need to be told
Yeah.
that. It's
Yeah,
like,
but
it's like, when you show up here, you cannot punch people in the face. Oh, okay, okay. Because I thought that, like, I mean, that's kind of interesting that we need rules like that.
right. It
Like, what's up,
is,
guys?
but I think it's another way of like creating a sense that this is something more than just people getting together somewhere. This has deeper meaning. There are going to be multiple levels to this. It adds depth by
Hmm.
giving it a special concept like frith,
Hmm.
which is also a value.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it also goes back to the tradition. I mean, this when we read the saga literature, this is what we learn about how they manage the General Assembly, for instance. Like there can be no bloodshed on a General Assembly in the Lökretta and all that space right there. So that's an interesting reconstruction, I guess. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Cool. Yeah. There was a couple more that I've been thinking about. Do Danny or JMO, do you have any examples, any ones that we need to
I mean,
pick on?
you cover it plenty, and also it's a whole can of worms I don't want to open up like as we're wrapping up. But I just want to say my piece on it. I really want like heritage and race to stop playing such a major part in this for so many people. Like
Oh man.
As an American that has no Nordic heritage, I get asked all the time, like, why do you do this? Why it's like it's safe to say that at the level I'm at now, I'm like in the top whatever percentile of like understanding of this stuff. I don't need to have like 5% Norwegian blood to like justify having that knowledge, right? And I could even camouflage and look the part if I wanted to, but like that would be gross, right? It's
Hmm.
I don't know. That's something that I personally, it's on the way out. I would say, I hear stories from decades ago, but it's something that's still stubbornly there a little bit that I want. And Mathias talks about this plenty on the Sacred Flame. So go over there for risk of opening up a can of worms here right at the end. But like, there are a lot of reasons why that shouldn't have been there in the first place. There are really bad reasons why it is there, and there are really good reasons to get rid of it. And that's
Hmm.
just sort of the piece that I'll say. I do not think blood makeup is a heathen value, nor should it be. And that's just
No.
my piece. I'll say.
Like
Absolutely.
every one of us are descended from some exploding star at the core elements of our physical being. So get over
Yeah.
it.
No, I agree. I think so. When it comes to that kind of stuff, right? These traditions that are like sourced from somewhere else. What we see is perhaps the sort of the one of like the worst examples of attitudes you can have with this kind of stuff. Because overall, it's widely present in American society, right? So many people here cultivate these like ideas of ancestry and how meaningful it is and all that stuff, right? And then what you get in those heathen groups, particularly in our case, we're talking about Nordic heathen groups, then you get, people fetishizing it, and of course also, just straight sourcing from the old Nazi stuff as well, and creating groups based on that, which is, some utter fucking bullshit.
That's
Um,
right.
uh, but it's interesting to consider that it is a sort of it is a broader social problem actually, that people are thinking in terms of like, oh, my ancestry is from here, so that gives some kind of value to me as a person. And it's like, fuck that shit. Like,
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, like
that's that's me saying my piece
I'm
on it. Fuck that shit.
I'm one of the only upright bass players of traditional Scandinavian music in the whole country. Yet I still get
Mhm.
asked, "Are you Swedish? Are you Norwegian?" It's like, what do I have to do, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
clearly, I can I not just dedicate myself to it because I just enjoy it, or it gives me meaning? Why does the meaning have to be wrapped up in how many Swedish grandparents I had? right?
Exactly, and you know, for me, whenever I show it, like show up at some kind of Scandinavian cultural function or something like that, some jackass will point out, "Oh, the Danes are over there," and it's like, I don't care. I don't know these
You're like,
fucking
thanks. Now I know to stay
Jeez.
away.
Yeah, exactly. I gotta go
God.
that way.
Jeez.
It's like, okay, so what? Like, I don't necessarily have anything in common with people just because they got some Danish heritage and I have some Danish heritage. Like, so what? Like,
Right. And ancestors can be a part of your practice. They're a part of my
yeah,
practice.
yeah,
Honoring
mine
the
too.
ancestors, the just fault of the multitude of dead people
Mm-hmm.
that came from no specific wherever. First, um, everyone has those ancestors, and if you do the math on this, folks, I hate to break it to you, um, the tree doesn't continue to go like this. It comes back around more like that. Uh, I had a genealogist tell me once, like the history of humanity is really the history of second and third cousins having children
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah,
a large degree.
we can
Yeah.
boil our genetics down to what 1,200 individuals that survived some kind of major like climate
Calamity of
catastrophe.
some sort. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you
Well, I
know
mean,
when it comes to Scandinavians in particular, I just want to point out that we've been through a lot of evolutionary bottlenecks over the you know the millennia, right? So it's not necessarily a good thing to have genetics from the Scandinavian peninsula.
Yeah,
There's a lot of autoimmune
and
disease that comes out of there.
yeah, and those folkish types, the ones who love those Nazi ideas of special blood, um, they're romanticizing a specific group of people in a specific place at a specific time, and then putting Nazi ideology on them.
Hmm.
They couldn't be more wrong from the first step they took.
Hmm.
So that concept is nonsense from the very start.
then
And
you
I
have the
said what I
issue of like
said.
the, but then you have the issue of like people, fetishize specifically Viking age ancestors if they even have any, right?
Mm,
And then skip literally 800 years, and then they're like, they don't matter. They weren't Vikings hypothetically, right?
Right.
But Lonnie, I
yeah.
do also want to appreciate what you brought up, and this is something that I do struggle with a lot. Is like ancestors matter, but how and why? And I don't think it's blood related, which is the way
Mm,
ancestors are typically treated in that way, right? But you are
right.
again, very important for you to bring up a point that checks me. Is just like I do struggle a lot with like blood doesn't matter, but ancestors do. So how do
Hmm.
you right? And I think
Can,
you can. It's very easy to see where they get conflated. But
Well,
can I
you
go on a
break them up
rant?
into categories of like ancestors of blood. Sure, those are the people who had sex that ultimately produced you. And then you have ancestors more of like spirit, I guess, or tradition, what I would call them in my practice. And those are the people who, from music or religion or philosophy or cooking or food or what have you, that truly, really inspired you to be who you are, who have way more influence on who you shaped out to be than the people who produced your genetic structure, right? Those people are just as important, if not more important, really, as a concept of ancestor veneration in my world than like you're talking about. It's a much bigger and diverse thing than just people who had sex,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think similarly. I mean, ancestors to me are also, rocks and trees and rivers and mountains and meadows and all those kinds of things. Ancestors to me are also yeah, influential people in various ways, right? And you know, I have probably at least like in my own mind, a closer relationship to Snorri Sturluson, even though I talked a lot of shit on that guy. Um,
remember, that was one of the first things I had to clarify with you when I started learning from you and assisting you. I was like, "Do you like him?"
do you
I don't
like
know.
this
Like,
guy?
I can't tell.
But I would say that I
It's
have a
complicated.
yeah, it's complicated, but I have a closer relationship to him than I do to my like a paternal grandfather, for instance, like a guy that I hardly knew. So it's like I know Snorre Sturluson's life and history and his literature much better than a lot of other people out there that I've otherwise been in contact with, right? So in that sense, I could definitely consider him an ancestor. He's also, and like the weird thing is how often I actually conflate that guy with Odin.
Isn't he? You could even go deeper and say, isn't he the reason you have a job?
But he's also the reason I have a job for sure.
Yeah.
Boom.
I mean, he's the reason for a lot of things, and we
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
shouldn't get into all of them right now, but we certainly can later.
Awesome. Are there any last little things we need to wrap up? That Jameson, you started a last little thing and opened up a can of worms, and then we took another.
Hey, I'm not talking again. Don't worry.
Any other small things that we need to add to the mix here?
I was going to throw in one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a book recommendation. That's all. But see, I told you I have a book. Our Troth, third edition, volume 3, Heathen Life by Ben Wagner, has an enormous section in here that was painfully and beautifully done on philosophy and ethics and different schools of thought and how that can shape up into your life as a heathen today. And none of it is dogmatic. It is very open-ended, asking deeper questions, exploring different schools of thought, different codes that have been created from different religions even, and really taking a deep dive into a difficult subject. And I have said many times over, that chapter alone is worth the price of this entire book. And it's a thick one. Not to mention like an eighth of that is citations and sources for you academic folks.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I'm salivating.
Proper meat on the bone.
That's right. So that was my last thing I wanted to throw in.
I like that. I also want to contribute a book recommendation. I only have it on audiobook, so I can show you what my screen looks like on my phone. It's called Origins by Lewis Dartnell. Origins: How Earth's History Shaped Human History, and it's actually I was reminded of it when you said the thing about us descending from stardust or whatever it was that you said before, Lonnie, because it is really fascinating how Dartnell like combines our human evolution with geological phenomena of various kinds.
That is so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
He talks about heat circulation through air and water, for instance, tectonic movements. I mean, the whole reason that we exist as the type of species that we are today is because of, certain climatic events caused by the Himalayas in East Africa, right? And that's how biped monkeys turned into us.
Awesome.
So that's really fascinating. And the cool thing is that he also like goes through so many different historical examples. Like he works with the Roman Empire, with the Chinese Empire, nomadic populations across the Eurasia, and why did they exist and why were they a problem and so on, and then ties it back into geologic phenomena of various kinds. Really fascinating. So yeah.
So it's called Origins?
Yeah, Origins. And subtitle, Origins: How Earth's History Shaped Human History by Lewis Dartnell. Or Dartnell.
That is going into the reading pile. I've not read that.
I didn't know this was a book club.
We're heathens. We're heathens. We have uncovered a heathen value.
Yes. Books.
Books, baby.
Don't touch the stuff.
All
Don't
right.
look at us.
I think that's a wrap.
Knew her, never heard of her.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of heathen values. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jameson.
Yeah. Thank you, Jameson. Thank you, Dani. That was awesome. Thanks for jumping in. And Jameson, thank you for you getting Dani involved. She was content to sit there
Oh,
and said, "Leave me alone."
I've gotten to know Dani very well in the time that we've spent together, and yeah, love you, Dani.
Basically a vampire. You got to invite me in.
You told us not to, and you stayed anyway.
You're welcome.